Right, well, I've got quite a bit to get through. When I did the timing on this, it did take longer than an hour, so I'm going to whiz through quite a bit. The other thing I will say, at the back end of this, there is some supplementary slides as well, because when I went through one of the topics, it took 20 minutes alone, so I thought, no, can't do that. So I hacked it down considerably. Okay, oh, and the reason for doing this was at the Malmo Bootcamp. I was chatting with somebody, and they, although they were quite experienced, there were certain things that they just didn't know. So this is really about knowledge sharing, and I called it the teaching new dogs old tricks, because it really is sort of aimed towards maybe our younger new audience to VMS, and you know, after you've been doing this quite a while, there are lots of things that you learn. Okay, so application can be really different from the explanation. So it's not always obvious that you can use something to do something. So sometimes we find interesting ways of doing things, possibly not as intended. There are quite a lot of undocumented things. So the Parsec website does have some really good stuff on there. So we're going to look at a few things. So we're going to look at DCL, some system management tips as well, booting, shutdowns, parameters, shadowing, uncommon problems and their solutions. You'll notice the T-shirt is from a TV program called Blackadder that Rowan Atkinson starred in. Or you may know him as Mr. Bean. There is relevance to it, and that'll become clear. I'm also going to look at one or two third-party utilities, and really the objective of this is to make your life easy. Okay. Oh, when I issue the slides for these, there will be a whole heap of notes at the bottom of them. Disclaimer. So Stephen Hoffman was famous with this, but you know what? You've got to be really careful here, because there's dangerous stuff here, really dangerous stuff. So most situations do have unique aspects, and I'm not going to accept any responsibility for the misuse or abuse or whatever of any of these, right? And there are version and dependencies, but platforms do vary. And sometimes a file that I'll talk about here may not be on your version. Why it's missing, I don't know. So anyway, yeah, it might not work the way you expect. Backups, always back up your systems. Volume shadowing is not backup. Okay, and check the documentation as well, because there are certain little things in there. And if you're going to use this for any production whatsoever, do it on a test system first. And that doesn't mean a little partition somewhere on your production. It means a totally separate system. Okay, so I'm going to start at the beginning about booting systems. So gone are the days when we used to have those LE36s and 120s and boxes of paper, and you'd run through all the paper to find out what actually happened. You'd be booting your system, and there's some error message pops up. What happened? What's wrong? Something's wrong in the startup. How do you find out? So startup P2. Now put it in mod params, because if it's not in there when you do an autogen, it'll be blanked. So put it into there. If you set it to CD, these are the definitions. So C will display checkpointing, and D will actually provide the actual output from your startup log. So whatever would go on the console will actually go in there, plus you'll get the little checkpoints. And whatever else would go onto OPA 0. If you want a bit more information, this actually switches on verification, not during startup.com, but during SciStartup.com and all the things, all the Sci stuff that you would edit yourself. So you can actually find out what command went wrong when you get that error message. If you want everything and you want a huge log file, then just set it to true or 1 or VCD. They're all the same. It'll put all the information in there for you. and it will literally verify everything from startup, all from startup.com all the way through. Another advantage of it is, particularly if it's a system you don't touch very often and you're not really sure what the customer is doing, of course, it gives you those timestamps of when they booted the system or attempted to. Now, the other thing, of course, to mention is that there is the lesser used startup database for Sysman as well. There's stuff that you can put into there. That will give you a lot of control. Now, when you're shutting down a system, if you have a system with many batch queues, many printers, it really sits there. And so you're waiting for the actual queue manager to shut down. And it is painfully slow, especially if you told all the users, oh, I'm just going to do a 5-minute reboot. It might take 5 minutes to boot, but you could be taking half an hour to shut the system down. Now, this is where there are some variations. There is something called, and it's not on all versions, and you need to look for it, shutdown 0010. So in there, and it's all commented out, but if you uncomment it, you'll find what it does is it actually resets batch queues, resets printer queues, and it initiates the queue manager checkpoint. And you could even put your own commands in there as well. So this is executed. So you've got your size shutdown, but before it actually tries to shut down all the queues, it executes this. And so it will quickly close off those queues. So you won't be waiting for queue manager to do all its stuff. So and it happens before the stop queue shutdown. There is a quicker way to take your system down. And there may be cases when you do actually want to use this. So the important thing is this is based on logicals, and by definition, they are non-existent. But the thing about a shutdown or even a crash is a crash isn't really a crash. It's actually a controlled shutdown. This is really the big difference with VMS and other operating systems. The only way to really shut down your system without any of this is to simply pull the plug on it. Anyway, so a few important things here. Shutdown $inform nodes. Now, if you've got a cluster and you are shutting a system down, in order to avoid worrying everybody, just put the name of the system that is going down, and only the people logged onto that system will be told that it's going down. This is a bit of a historical one, really. So these are all the logicals. OPC $unload. This is when you do dismount/unload on a disk, and it would physically spin down the disk. It's with the lack of spinning disks, it's not really important. Do you want to reboot your system? Set it to true or 1, and your system will initiate a reboot. Cluster shutdown is an interesting one, which also works in combination a little bit with remove node. So if you have a cluster and you've got a voting member and you're going to take it out, the big problem is when you lose that vote, your cluster will hang. However, cluster shutdown sets at a low level and it waits for everybody else to say, I am now shut down, and then we'll close down. But remove node has a special little function. It will take away the vote from the system. It will enable itself to run without quorum, and then it will then tell everybody else in the cluster, please do effectively a set cluster / expected vote. So it totals up all the votes and now says, I have quorum. So it will continue. Of course, not if you're taking away the only voting member. If you have no votes, you're not going anywhere. Also, dump files as well. So if you don't need a dump file, set no dump. That will stop your rows, because that can take a little while. And power off as well. So some of our architectures later on support that. That's again logical. And if you do want feedback data, because that's one of the things that shutdown will ask you for, simply run that program, MCR $AGEN feedback. So MCR, monitor console routine. That's why you might see people saying, you could just say run the program, run system, but I use the old school MCR. And then you can simply say MCR, OPC crash, bang, down it goes. And if you define your reboot, it'll come back for you. Of course, it's not shutting down any queues that I talked about before. And you could, of course, define your shutdown command to be this. Note that I've got blanks in a couple of the quotes, so that what it will do is ask you whatever you haven't specified. So it'll ask you minutes and your options, and everything else will just be defaulted. Okay, there is an easier, safer way of doing all of this. This is actually documented. So you can create these reboot detached command files. So as you can see, I've kind of explained it out just to help you. So there are 7 parameters that you can pass to shutdown when you call it. So if you write yourself a command file that looks like this, so you can define your shutdown $inform nodes and put in whatever your system is, and then simply call this with any text in there that you want. And there's an alternative, there's a power off one as well. So create those 2 command files, you'll get the slides afterwards. And then you write yourself another command file, which is the do detach shutdown. And it will simply do this. It'll run login out, it'll create a process name, and it will then take the command file that you've got, which is then going to call the next command file. And of course, it'll create a log file as well. So this is how you can create logs of your shutdowns. So it's a nice way of doing it. The example that Digital provided actually had system as the username, saying create process on the system. However, I've come across too many systems, where somebody has modified the system account and it's no longer useful. So you just put 1,4 in there, it's safe. Give it a high enough priority so you know nothing's going to interrupt it, and off it goes. The last line, schedule, that's optional. You put an absolute time in there, you can say, 1700 or whatever time. But if you don't, you hit the return key, it'll run. You can run it as a batch job as well. So just bear in mind you can do that. And of course, I should mention Sysman does have a shutdown node option in the cluster, so you can do that as well. And of course, all the reboot options, you can put them in. Multiple ways of doing it. Okay, the T-shirt. So I had a support call, and he said the system desk fails. We tried to restore it from a backup, and it runs out of space, and my VAX won't boot. I'm talking about VAX here, but this applies to all architectures because people can make mistakes on all architectures. So basically, they've made a backup without the /image. So there was no bootlock pointers. There was multiple copies of the VMS commentary, syscomm, of course. These were small disks. So it was basically a corrupted system disk. So we had sys0, syscommon, sysexe, and VMS common, and they all contained the same files, but as backup had just created them as duplicate versions. And it can happen on other platforms as well if people aren't using backup correctly. So here we go. So cunning, you could pin a tail on it, call it a weasel. So how do you recover from this situation? Well, preferably start with a clean init system disk and use standalone backup. I've got something to say about how we do a bit of standalone backup later. And there's a few ways you can do it. You can use backup /exclude. So if you correctly use backup, you can actually avoid certain areas that you don't want to restore. But backup /no alias, and that's really only applicable with image files. That is something that you should actually be using, because if you use backup /no alias, it will only go through the VMS commentary, and it won't go through each individual file entry. It won't go through the sys comment, it goes through the VMS comment, just the once. So the way we fixed it, so wherever your device is, you do a set file enter. So you end up with your VMS $common, which is where your real common area is, and do an entry into the actual route that you're going to boot. Then you've got to create the boot block. Now, this is done on different ways and different platforms, and the documentation does tell you how to do it. But here, so although this was a VAX, just to demonstrate here, you can do it for both VAX and Alpha. So when you run it, it says you want to do the VAX bit. Well, no, you don't, of course. Or you will if it's a VAX, obviously. But if it's an Alpha, you put in the Alpha, you give it the correct file specification where it is, and then you'll end up with a bootable system. This is different, as I say, for x86 and also for Titanium. So if you do the help within the set boot block, it'll tell you how to do it. sys$md is the command file that drives this, so you can have a look for that and see what's in there. And yes, we got the system booted. Now, this is the point probably where Rob will sort of go, no, don't tell people how to do that. So, system routes. So VMS $common for your system is the key area where your operating system lives. But you don't have to have just one. You could have multiple copies. And we have done this because we've wanted multiple copies of multiple versions of operating systems on the same disk, which also has application files which we're not changing.
Hey, Nick, can I say something?
Go on.
ESI would not be real happy if you do this.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to say, yeah. So this is not recommended, not really how you can do things, but it is something that you can actually do, is to manipulate these routes. So we had a course to actually do some testing here. Now, when you're doing some of this, you've got to keep changing the pointers. But you can also do this using LAN-CP network boots, because in there you can actually specify the route of where to boot from. So there are some little tricks that you can do there. Sysgen parameters. Now, the interesting thing is you get all kinds of warnings and messages and all sorts of mess there. It will come up and say, I don't know what this parameter is, but VMS will actually allow you to boot. But there are some other cases where you could use this. So you could save a copy of your existing operating system. So VMS upgrade, sometimes you might want to do these offline, but then when you want to implement the upgrade, could be a different type. There are multiple ways of doing this. A great way is to have another copy on another disk somewhere, and that is what I would recommend. However, by swapping those routes, you could shut down the system, repoint the routes, and then bring it back, and it comes up really quickly. Now, if you're going to use the upgrade system when you boot your distribution, it does trawl the whole disk. So if you have got multiple versions on there, it will strip everything off there. But as I say, it's not really recommended, but it's something you could do. Anyway, backup. Okay, backup image alias, I've mentioned that, so it doesn't traverse the sys commentary, just the VMS $common. This is something I said at the beginning when Nikita was talking about the backup / rewind / tape expiration. It is too easy to overwrite tapes, and this is something I believe is not present in ABS, but it really probably should be, because when you set up your ABS policies, you know exactly how long you want those tapes to live for. That lives in the ABS, the MDS database, but it doesn't put that information on the tape, which I just don't quite understand. And a lot of people say /ignore equals label. No, give it a label. You can use a list if you want for multiple volumes. The block size, don't use 8192, that's the default. 32215 is quite common to actually see. If you go up to 32767, it usually takes it down to that number. But the thing is, if you go over 32767, you cannot then manipulate that save set at all. You can't sort of copy it onto disk. You've got to use a product called Save Set Manager, available from VSI, in order to do save set manipulation. Journaling. So a lot of people will do backup/list and stick it in a big file. It's massive. So the easiest way to do your backup and to keep a record of what's on there is to say /journal. So just create your backup and then say just /journal and put your journal away somewhere. Now this is actually searchable. So if you wanted to find your file, you can then use a command like that. Backup, list, select as you would from your save set, but just point it at the journal. And it will tell you if that file exists on that tape. You don't have to list the tape itself. The information is in the journal and you can find that information. The other thing which is important is to always test your first backup. So most people will make a backup of their system, eject the tape, send it off site. But how do you know if it's readable or not? You should always check your first save set. And another tip is the first save set that you use with /rewind is also just put a little bit of information in there to know what else is on that tape. Bound volume sets. Yes, we've got some 25 member bound volume sets. I'm not going to go into details of why. However, it is possible if you do have, we had bound volume set and the first 3 members were overwritten by a Windows upgrade. Okay, I'm not going to explain why that happened, but if you have got a huge volume set, you can actually restore them individually using a backup image and tell it what the volume number is. Okay, PuTTY. Right. There's a whole bunch of slides at the end of this on here. But even today, even yesterday, somebody said to me, there's no do key on PuTTY. Oh, yes, there is. Okay, so it is not a VT terminal. However, because that mapping of the PC keyboard to the LK keyboard, it can be a bit of an issue. And you can get it on Linux. If you don't want to use Windows, you want to, that's fine. Does support SSH. But the default configuration as it comes out of the box, you need to juggle it for VMS. And the only real drawback I see with PuTTY is it's actually stored in the registry. You can extract it if you want to port it onto other systems. There's information on the web how to do that. But other terminal emulators are available. Reflections, OpenText, Terraterm, whatever. Right, okay. So use your normal 102 key keyboard with all the recommendations that I've got. I've swapped this around anyway. It'll work. So insert, delete, page up, page down. They behave as expected. End is a select, and home is find. If you want to go to beginning, end of line, Control E, Control H. That's your fast. Now the keypad is the same as the VT100, so numlock is your gold. And here's the thing, if you pressed Shift and plus, you will actually get the minus, because that's one of the keys that's missing. So that's where it is, which will be delete word in EDT, for those who are EDT users. Help is actually Shift 5. Do, there it is, it's Shift 6. And your F17 to F20, Shift F7, F8, Shift F. So your whole keyboard is available to you in PuTTY. F6 is interrupt, and F10, pause and break is exit. If you want to send an escape, Control 3 will do it for you. And then if you're using if you need a console command, you need to send a break. then you right click on the top window and it says special command break, so you can send your break. Right, so there are supplementary. Now, most laptops now don't have serial ports, but if you're in the field and you need to plug in, then what you need is an FTDI chipset USB serial adapters. The prolific ones, you can make them work, but don't use them, okay? FTDI is what you need to look for. Save your VMS friendly settings. You can either save them under default settings or simply create a profile which says VMS terminal. Recall VMS terminal and then put in your connection information. Window translation, you need to set it to DEC MCS. Or if you're going to create a log file and you want to make it printable, then use UTF-8 and poor man's line drawing. And it'll give you sort of plus signs and dashes and so on, but it will allow you to print it much easier. The bell. Now, I've actually got a couple of these, so you can create a custom sound file. And if you really want copies of these, my email address will be at the end of it. Send me an email and I'll send you. So store it in your music folder, and then under the actual profile, I've got VT100 beep and VT220 beep, so you can have your proper terminal sounds. And the Windows font as well, it defaults to Times New Roman. Yes, it's proportional, but it looks ugly. So I'd recommend Consoles. And for myself and the older members, it's much easier if you increase the font size as well. And a tip here, if you're using both production and test environments, the best thing you can do is alter the color of the background so you immediately know if you're on production or the live system. Really handy. Another thing that I've seen happen a lot, and particularly with new firewalls, is that your telnet connection will drop for no reason. And you're like, oh, what's going on? But there are keeper lives that you can enable. This is under the connection area. So if you set them to non-zero, I don't know, 60 seconds, 75 seconds, something like that, it'll keep sending little nulls and will keep that session alive for you. And also in TCP/IP as well, there is the probe timer from the other side, so that should keep the sessions alive. We did have all sorts of things getting disconnected. Those are little things to get around these firewalls that say, you're not talking, I'm going to cut the link. Okay, volume shadowing. Now, Rob did a great session on this, and he's covered some of these things, but here's a few practical tips that we've come across. So the SCB, the shadow control block, that little bit of data really is king over any operations that you're going to do. If you use mount/include, which is an implicit, when you boot your system disk, if it's a shadow member, it does the equivalent of what we call a mount/include. And you can use that command, which should, in theory, if the disks were cleanly dismounted, it will correctly mount them for you. There is an issue, though, if you have a lot of clock drift within cluster members. So, and this can happen, and I'm going to talk about clock drift in cluster members. So the SCB has a shadow generation number, but it is based on date and time. So if you, for whatever reason, have one system which is an hour in the future, and then your live disk, if you will, is on a system with the date and time which is earlier, it's going to get things really, really confused. So clock synchronization is really important. I know, I think it's Hein that had this little tip. If you are going to bring in a system, a new disk into the system, and you want to bring, apart from the init/shadow, if there's already data on it, doing a backup physical first will actually speed up the whole operation. Because the way that it works is read source, read target, and write if different. So that's how it does it for the full copies, and also the mini merges, the mini copies as well. if you have a development environment and you are you want to mimic your live environment, but you don't have a shadowing license, or even if you do have a shadowing license, the easiest thing is to mimic the DSA using logicals. That's the safest way of doing it. We did have a bit of an interesting situation where we were actually mounting, but read-only, shadow units that were also mounted on other systems, which again is something that VSI would very strongly discourage you from doing, but it does confuse the system. So the best way to do it is to use logical names. Now, the default copy size for shadowing is actually 127 blocks. But it is much better for controllers if you can set that on I/O boundaries. And I have seen some discussion about this, that the logical $$ copy underscore buffer underscore size sets that actual, if it's not defined, it defaults to 127. But on 3PAR, the recommendation is to have it on a multiple of 32. So you set it to 96, and that actually makes it for much more efficient copying. For an EVA, it's a multiple of 16, so you set it to 112. That just improves the efficiency.
Hey, Nick?
Yeah.
That was certainly true back then, but with the advent of SSDs on storage arrays, I'm not sure how critical that is anymore, though admittedly, I've not done the performance analysis, but I do remember back in the early 2000s, specifically with EVA, but the bound duration was significant. But with SSDs, not so sure.
Okay. One of those, your mileage may vary,
yes,
sort of things, quite definitely. And as Rob was saying yesterday in his session, there is this $$ merge delay factor. So this is really an availability system. It's your unit is running, and you really don't want to harm the performance that's going on your cluster. But if you really do need to speed things up, you can set per drive. So you set it on your DSA. So the normal setting is 5,000, which is kind of the background, but 20,000 is the maximum value, I believe. That's what I've seen documented. So by increasing that figure, it will make your system much more aggressively shadow, do the copying for your disks, but there is a performance penalty, needless to say. And the command show shadow by priority will let you know exactly what you've got. So you may have important data disks and less important data disks, so you can set that however you want. Now, this is something I started to talk about in session. So we have a disaster tolerant split site cluster, and we've got actually 10 gig intersite links. But nonetheless, there's still a lot of data to be copied. So always use mini copy. So here's a situation. We've got site A, site B. So we're doing this for a couple of reasons. One is because we're messing about with everything on the system. And the other thing is we're doing disaster recovery testing. So, and this might seem counterintuitive, but when we go through it, you'll understand why. So, set your shadow max copy to 0. It's a dynamic sysgen parameter. It's a dynamic parameter, but it potentially increase site B. So when site B boots, as it comes up and you start to mount, those bitmaps are actually copied over to site B. And so we've got a total of 4 members in the shadow set. So we're going to go from 2 to 4. So there's going to be 2 sets of replication on the systems that are joining. And what this means is that site B actually does all the reading to write to its local disks. That's what the operation that it's doing. If you let site A undertake any copying, it's going to be pushing writes over the network. And that is really costly. That's why it's actually much faster to use the joining system to perform all the copy operations. So yeah, it's network writes are expensive. And so you remember it's that read source, read target, write target if you need. And it's going to be quicker for me to write to my local disk than for a remote system to write to a local disk. All the lock-in and everything else involved, it just slows it down. Okay, sysgen parameters. These are some that probably not often used. So if you are doing a conversational boot, but you're going to change some things, but you only want them to live for one boot, then write sys params. The moment you change one parameter, then write sys params is set to 1. So after you've fiddled with whatever you're going to change, just set it back to 0. And then it will only remember it for just this one boot. You can make yourself a kind of a minimum VMS by setting write lock system disk. So you can actually stop your system disk from being written to. And that could be really handy to actually make as good as you possibly can backup of your system disk, because backup ignore equals interlock. Yeah, it'll kind of work, but one of these days you might fall down a hole and find you're missing some files. So really you need to avoid backing up your system disk if it's being written to. So show/startup. So that is going to always point to, or should always point to, startup.com. Or you could set it to OPA 0. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, it's that, what's the system password? We don't know. So when it comes up and you get your $, do a set noon, do set no verify, and then do a spawn no wait of startup.com, and then your system will actually come up. Now, quite often someone will say, oh, I've forgotten the system password. Right, okay, no problem. Set UAF alternate 1, continue, and you find that you can't log in because some bright spark has created a sysuaf alt.dat. So that is one of the security things. If you think somebody's going to come along, then they need this next level thing to use OPA 0. So when you are changing sysgen parameters or you want to change things, of course, it's normally you do a write current, use current, and so on, but you can give it any name that you like. So if you are going to be messing about with sysgen parameters and you want to store a set elsewhere, then simply write out a new name and you will keep a copy of your parameters. Yeah, so you've got your right, you can do write current and write active. And here's another little bit of shorthand as well. So you can do show whatever parameter name if you want to change it. But if you then say set and the dot, I'm not quite sure how clear that shows. You can actually, it will refer to the parameter that you've just shown. So if you show reconnect interval, normally 20, you want to change it for some reason, set dot new value in seconds, and then of course write current, write active, whatever you want to do. This may not be very applicable now. Anybody using EVAs at all? Okay, right. Now the big problem with an EVA is it's flash based, the console. So how on earth do you get to it? Well, what you need to look for is portable Firefox, and it is exactly as it says. So you may need to get it off Internet Archive, Wayback Machine. It's a portable. You do not install it. You just simply stick the executable somewhere. It is, warning, version 47.0.1 plus all its bugs, and the last version of Flash support. Stick it somewhere and you run it up and point it at your EVA, and you can log into your system as you used to be able to. So that is a way of getting it, yeah.
Yeah, that kit's also good for very old fiber switches.
Yes.
Flash based too, which
yep.
I also deal with.
Okay, yep. So yeah, I haven't dealt with them, but yeah, so there you go. And that's how you can get Flash. Remote tape reloading. I only learned this one very recently. So whatever you run in a backup and way away somewhere, your tape gets unloaded. Dismount. You've forgotten to use dismount slash unload, and your tape has become unloaded. Phone somebody. Oh, can you put the tape back in? Or you walk down the corridor. Well, there's a side effect of running SCSI info. If you run SCSI info against the tape drive, it will reload your tape. Yes, and it's available on VAX and Alpha and Integrity, and I don't know when tapes appear, if they do, on x86. I didn't believe it myself, but I tried it, and this was LTOs, DLTs, it just reload. So if it's at that reload, it doesn't inquire. You'll get a whole load of screen of stuff, but it will reload your tape for you. My LTO is a little bit temperamental, but I'm not quite sure. There might be a fault on it, but it worked. I don't know about DAT tapes. The problem with the DAT tape is it spits them out, so I don't think that'll work. Right, I mentioned clock drift. So I was having this issue and I couldn't really understand what was going on, but the queue manager will only run on one node, and that is considered, quotes, the master clock. But if you've got a job that runs on another node and it has a clock with drift and you're using the time on there, you'll find that it will execute on that system. And if it's aimed on that system, it will think it's running at that time, but the queue manager will actually keep firing it based on its time. So you've really got to make sure that all your clocks inside a cluster are synchronized. I had this job that ran about 20 times. I really couldn't figure it out until I found out there was a few seconds drift. Right, DCL label processing in batches. This is in the documentation, but it's not often talked about. So batch $restart. So if you put this into your command file at the beginning, let's say you've got a long batch job and your system fails partway through. What you do is you create labels in your command file, and as I say, this is taken directly really from the manual. So you set your restart value first part. And so it'll know exactly where it's going, run part one, and then you've got another label for second part and setting your restart value. So if you've already done some processing, it's already taken several hours, the system fails and then comes back. Well, if $restart is defined, then the symbol batch $restart will actually be stored away in this is all into the queue manager log files. You can actually avoid having to rerun certain parts of your batch jobs. Right, DCL. Okay, it's interpreted. I've done a little bit of this because is it Wayne at Parsec? He came along to one of my earlier presentations, and I talked about this. So there's a whole load of stuff here, really, with DCL. It's dumb, it's stupid. You can have two labels. You can break a lot of programming rules. There's no decimals. Symbols can redefine commands. Labels can be predefined symbols. Symbols can be labels. Variables are often constants. That's a bit of a chemistry joke. You can mix modes, numeric and string values. DCL doesn't care. And they can be both your worst enemy and your best friend. Lexical functions can do some really interesting things, and things can break and you may not even know. So debugging DCL can be a bit of a pain. So one of the techniques I've used is you can actually create a symbol called debug and simply set it as the exclamation point, or you can set it as blank. So when DCL encounters the symbol, it'll either execute that line or it will just skip it. And something else that I've used a little bit later, you can also kind of do the reverse thing. If you want to just test the logic without doing any damage, you can have another one called dummy. And you can set that so that when you have set it, it won't do the command. And when you clear it, then your command procedure is quotes live. And of course, you can have debug 1, debug 2, all kinds of things like that. I've got to give a plug to DCL check. It's available on the freeware. It's great. There is also DCL debug as well, and it's mostly written in German, and the documentation is in German. However, quite recently, I actually pushed it through Google. I actually translated it to more or less English.
I have it in English.
Sorry?
I have it in English.
Oh, okay. I hadn't found that then.
If you would like, I can share.
Okay.
I even modified it somewhat.
Okay, thank you. Right, so basic tricks. If you want to use quotes in strings, it becomes really difficult. So the easiest way is to simply define something called quotes and put the ASCII value of the quote in there, and you can then actually use the quote in strings. So if you're generating a command file and then you want to get it to put quotes in there, that's the technique that you need to use. So it looks a bit messy, but your command file is actually correct. Escape is another one, of course, if you want to do a little bit of, reverse flashing text and all that kind of stuff. You can put hexadecimal values in there, of course. So that's why I've used that. Sorry? Won't it? I'm not sure which.
Escape open.
Is it? Escape.
Open bracket.
Is it? Okay.
Escape line number 4.
Yeah.
Writes its output. Escape open bracket.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Right. I shall alter that. Right. $get SYI, you can put any sysgen parameter in there and it will return it for you. And one of the annoying things quite often is when somebody's defined, who've got this marvelous login command file and they've defined all these commands. The problem is when you start to run something else, it comes up with all sorts of errors because it's not defined as a command. Set symbols / scope is your friend here, but not very many people seem to put that into command procedures. So simply tagging some additional junk, if you will, after the command. So I would use delete x, submit x, and then it becomes the default command. Of course, it's only the first 4 characters, so that's why I've put directory x, for example, or dir x. That will have the same effect. File handling. You might want to actually start to combine some files. The problem is in DCL, when you just open to write a file, it comes up as VSC format. And then if you try to concatenate VSC format with your normal carriage return carriage control, it does incompatible attributes and it won't do it. So the easiest way to do it, if you copy null to whatever the file is, and then do an open/append rather than an open/write. And then you can actually do a lot more file manipulation. When you have opened a file, the other thing is, I don't know whether to mention it on here, my text is a logical, so you can actually treat it as a logical and you can copy files into it. This was a bug that well, it wasn't really, it was a bug in my procedure. I didn't quite understand why it was doing it, but when I dissected it, it made a bit of sense. So I actually wanted to generate a date and time and say /after, and I was getting this error opening 08 test 00. I'm thinking, what's going on here? But it was the colon, which was actually annoying, if you will, the symbol substitution that was going on in the commands file. So I actually had to create an absolute time, and the way that I did it is on the second point. So I'm simply using $CV time to form an absolute time, because trying to feed /after into the translation, and DCL just doesn't like it. I almost had an argument with VSI support over this, but I kind of get the problem. This is really because DCL is interpreted and not compiled. A compiler would catch this, but the interpretation wouldn't. If you're going to end up with, you can see I've got a problem there. The issue is there. I've kind of missed the quote. So even though there is a set noon, it still explodes. And that's really the point here. So that the set noon will not always save you. And it just exploded at this point, and it did not execute the rest of this.
Because they conjoin nesting structure and data inconsistency.
Yeah. So it will actually miss out, or, so sometimes your jobs may actually fail. So just be aware of code. But as I say, DCL check, that will find it. There's another silly one there. You can actually, because again, it's contained within the end if, it blanks it out, it ignores it. So the if end if, it just won't see it, because your label is actually contained within it. Okay. You can dynamically change your labels, so you can create it on. You can use $CV time and create a label, and my label is now going to be. So you can this is almost code changing on the fly. So you can do a little bit of fun with changing your labels and defining labels. Okay, well, I've managed to get through it actually in time. So those are my email addresses. If you want copies of the sound files, they are really tiny, and you can put those into PuTTY. There are a whole load of more PuTTY stuff there, as you can see, about keyboards and so on. So they will all be part of the main presentation. Let me just go back to there.